Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Hello, nice to see all of you again. We are in the second week of Elements of Literature and Creative Communication. During the first week, we discussed various insights concerning literature, and in this week, we are going to discuss different forms and genres concerning literature and how language, society and culture, the trifecta of language, society and culture, it interacts with literature as such. I have some interesting quotes here that discuss the intersections between literature and society here. The first one is by Goethe, a poet laureate, an extraordinary poet who proposed the concept of world literature for the first time. In fact, today comparative literature and world literature, they have got to gain much from the works of Goethe, and therefore we begin this class with Goethe's well-known quote. He says that the decline of literature indicates the decline of a nation. Look at the connections here. He is equating literature and nation, and they are directly proportional to each other. So, inversely speaking, the rise of literature in a society is indicative of the rise of societal structures, societal standards as a whole. Conversely speaking, if there is a decline in societal standards and societal values, automatically there would be a decline in literary values too. So, they are related. There is a wonderful correlation between literature and society here. We have Salman Rushdie. You need no introduction to Salman Rushdie because you are already aware of his international stature. Salman Rushdie says that literature is a place I go to explore the highest and lowest places in human society and in the human spirit, where I hope to find not absolute truth, but the truth of tale of the imagination and of the heart. Literature becomes a place of solace. Literature becomes a place where you can take your battles and fight out things there. So, literature also becomes a place of recluse for Salman Rushdie here. So, here I have an interesting concept discussed in detail by A.K. Ramanujan, another well-known linguist, writer, poet. He says in his influential essay, Where Mirrors Are Windows, he discusses literature's relationship with society in very many insightful ways. The title of the article is Where Mirrors Are Windows. So, it's true. In fact, it's true when we say that literature holds up a kind of a mirror to society, because it reflects the follies, the foibles, the virtues, the vices of society. But it's not just a mirror, because if we need to find only the reflection of society in literature, we don't need literature as such, because we live in society, right? So, this is where literature goes a step ahead and also becomes a window. So, here the concept of mirrors and windows, they are more like metaphors. So, mirror is a place where you find reflection, where you get to see how you are. So, that helps you to shape up your appearance to a certain extent. But window, metaphorically speaking, is a place through which you look at the world around. In fact, it is a gateway to the world around. right? Window is a gateway to the world around. So, literature on the one hand acts as a mirror reflecting society as it is, and also allowing the society to interact with the world around. When I say society, people in it or the readers, right. So, here is an extraordinary opportunity that literature is creating. What does it do? It reflects society, and also it provides members of society an opportunity to look out, through which they get to have a kind of an exposure to the world around. So, that is why we have this concept of mirrors and windows. So, in the same essay, Ramanujan argues that literature can have a kind of a three-way responses, three-way relationships with society. Of course, literature has many ways of connecting with society. We have discussed that in the first class. But here in this particular essay, he brings out three relationships that literature and society share with each other. One is the responsive relationship. What do you mean by responsive relationship? Well, literature looks at society and responds, and it is also true the other way around. Society looks at literature that is produced within its ambit and responds to that. So, both of them are open to influences from each other. So, it's a relationship of response. The second type of relationship is one of reflexive in nature. So, what does reflexive relationship mean here? Well, when literature looks at society, it goes into a kind of an introspective mode, and when society also looks at itself through the literature, then it also tries to introspect. So, this is probably a mirror stage, it is a mirror stage. So, if some corrections are required to your appearance, you do that, right. Similarly, probably literature and society, they can correct each other. The third is a subversive stage or a subversive relationship. Here what happens? Literature looks at society and finds society inadequate in many ways. Therefore, it goes into a kind of a ballistic mode and acts as a subversive force. It subverts, it disrupts, so that it can create society afresh in the way humanity wants it, in the ideal way humanity wants it. So, these are roughly speaking some kind of relationships that we can forge between literature and society. Please remember, these are almost cursory areas, and it is not that we exhaust a topic when we discuss them. We do not do that, you know that well. We initiate you to think about the larger concepts and consequences through these lectures. Going on to the major, he is a major Peruvian writer, Llosa, Mario Vargas Llosa, also a Nobel laureate, well known politician, writer, journalist, poet, playwright. He dons many roles. He says that good literature is absolutely necessary for a society that wants to be free. Now, look how literature acts as a kind of a corrective agent here. Literature is required for a society to be free. It becomes a kind of an active agent that ensures freedom in very many respects. Because literature at its core, we discussed this idea in the very first class or probably during the first week. Literature is a space, literature is a space, or we can call literature an agent that brings in a democratic space in the ethos, in the sensibilities as well. Society generally should be democratic, but literature, what does literature do? Literature also brings in a kind of a democratic ethos, democratic sensibilities among us. Therefore, Llosa says that literature is essential to bring in the concept of freedom. I have two excerpts here. Please read these excerpts, and after reading these excerpts, we can take up a couple of questions. These questions, more reflective questions about our perspective towards the subjects discussed here. The first is by Charles Dickens and written in the 19th century. "I'll tell you," said she, in the same hurried, passionate whisper, "what real love is. It is blind devotion, unquestioning self-humiliation, utter submission, trust and belief against yourself and against the whole world, giving up your whole heart and soul to the smitter, as I did." The second is by E.M. Foster, "A Room with a View," beginning of the 20th century. "This desire to govern a woman, it lies very deep, and men and women must fight it together. But I do love you surely in a better way than he does," he thought. "Yes, really in a better way. I want you to have your own thoughts even when I hold you in my arms." Obviously, the subject in both these short passages is about the relationship between man and woman that you can see. They were written in two different time periods. They were, one was in the 19th century, you can call it mid 19th century, the other the early part of the 20th century. Now I have a couple of questions to raise. Do you think, as far as their sentiments regarding their subjects, or their treatment of love, is there any change? Is there any change in the sentiment? Did you notice any change in the sentiment? And if you have noticed the change in the sentiment, do you think you can correlate it with the ethos of the time in which these works were produced? And generally speaking, or in a manner of generalization, do you think they reflect the spirit of the age? Are these changed attitudes, are they uniform across society? It's not that, in fact, both of them have been taken from a society and a culture. It's been taken from the same society and culture, So, if you have noticed change, do they reflect the change in the period in which they were written? Or do you think these things are uniform? So, we have already discussed in the last class, we have created a forum for you. You can answer any of these questions. These are questions more of self-reflexive kind of questions. So, therefore, you can post your comments there. Please remember, don't be in a hurry to post anything. Pause for a while. These questions do not direct you to answer in a particular way. No, they are just general questions. It's not that you need to agree with them or you need to disagree with them. You can partially agree, partially disagree. That's your call. But they are not indicative of the direction you need to take as far as answering them. All right. I have another excerpt, this time from poetry. And again, here, unlike the first set of excerpts, these excerpts here, they are taken from the early part of the 20th century. Again, the subject of both these excerpts of poems, it's war, their attitude towards war. The first is by Rupert Brooke from a poem called The Soldier, written in 1915. Now look at this. "If I should die, think only this of me, that there is some corner of a foreign field that's forever England. There shall be in that rich earth a richer dust concealed." How war is being eulogized here, how in the course of war, if you die, you think you would be dying in a part of the soil, though you are far away from the land that you belong to, you would still want to consider that land where you are about to die as your land, something like that. The second is by Wilfred Owen, 1918, hardly a couple of years of difference. Our limbs so dear achieved, our sides full nerved, still warm, too hard to stir. Was it for this the clay grew tall? Oh, what made fatuous sunbeams toil to break earth's sleep at all? So here, as the title of the poem reflects, the poet is disillusioned with war. In fact, he realizes that all the nobility that's attributed to war has become futile. So he has a feeling that has everything been wasted. So here, as I said, both of them are written during the same time, but by two different individuals. So look how they reflect the ethos of society. So it's not that you need to have a considerable gap between two pieces of work to reflect. In fact, works written during the same period can also present different perspectives related to society. So more or less they reflect diversity in perspectives. We have also discussed that in the first week. So that's how we look at literature and society. These are some broad contours. In fact, what we have done so far is to discuss the broad contours of relationship between literature and society. Moving on, we are going to discuss different forms and genres of literature. We need to have a closer understanding about the structure of literature as such. So broadly speaking, we can call them forms and genres. Literature can be broadly classified into three distinct forms: poetry, prose and drama. Most of the times people confuse forms with genres. Please notice the pronunciation of the word G-E-N-R-E. It has a French root, genre, all right. Generally speaking, form is related to the structure of the literary piece. In other words, it is structural. In its principle, form is related to the structure of a work of art. So when we say a structure, because when you look at a particular piece, you know whether it is a novel or a long piece of poem, right? Just at the outset. Of course, there are complications to that particular simplistic understanding. We are going to discuss these things at a little later stage. There are nuances to the argument we are presenting here. We would be discussing this nuance at a particular at a later stage, all right. But you can distinguish prose and poetry. We are going to discuss more of that in subsequent slides. Genre is related to the content of that work of art. It is related to the content of the work of art. Say for instance, you are talking about the element of mystery. You want to write about the element of mystery. You want to write about crime thrillers. You want to write about romance. You want to write about science fiction. So this is more about the content, right? Because when you read a particular work of art, you would know whether it is historical, whether it is crime thriller, whether it is mystery, horror. So this is about content. So content based division of literature is called genre, generally speaking, and structure based division can be called form. So in order to understand this concept better, we can use the metaphors of architecture and interior design. Form is more about architecture, the outer structure, and genre is more about the interior design, all right. And interestingly, prose and verse, in fact many people think that prose and poetry, they are opposites. No, they are definitely not opposites, they are different manifestations of language. Again, we are going to discuss that in subsequent slides, but for time being let us know that verse and prose both have Latinate roots, and verse means to turn around or to bend. Prose means it is to be straightforward, to go straightforward or direct. They have a Latinate root, and accordingly prose, in prose when you read any prose piece, the meaning is generally simple, it is straightforward, what you see. Again, there is a nuanced argument to this, we would be discussing that a little later. And when you look at a piece of verse, then you need a couple of readings to understand that, something like this. But leaving aside these classifications, very broadly speaking, we can say that there are, because literature is all about sensibilities, right. So, we can say that there is prose sensibility and there is poetic sensibility. So, forget form, forget structure here. When you read something, if the experience that you derive out of it is more intense and more imaginative, it is poetic sensibility. If it is more philosophical and theoretical, you can call it and dense, you can call it prose sensibility, all right. So, going ahead, how do you distinguish prose and poetry? Now, here are again two interesting pieces. Please go through this and you will be able to automatically spot what is a prose piece and what is a piece of verse here, all right. So, this is by a writer called Gordon Taylor, written sometime in the late 1960s. It is an excerpt from the book The Biological Time Bomb. Please read this. Between the ages of 30 and 90, the weight of our muscles falls by 30% and the power we can exert likewise. The number of nerve fibers in a nerve trunk falls by a quarter. The weight of our brains falls from an average of 3.23 pounds to 2.27 pounds as cells die and are not replaced. This passage is discussing the concept of growing old. Look at the details, look at the diction. And now I have another piece. This is by T.S. Eliot, a well-known poet, modernist and a Nobel laureate. Let me disclose the gifts reserved for age, to set a crown upon your lifetime's effort. First, the cold friction of expiring sense, without enchantment, offering no promise, but bitter tastelessness of shadow fruit as body and soul begin to fall asunder. Second, the conscious impotence of rage at human folly and the laceration of laughter at what ceases to amuse. And last, the rending pain of reenactment of all that you have done and been. Both of them discuss the concept of growing up. In that sense, you can find parallels between both these excerpts here, though they are odd, they are still parallel, and therefore you can compare them. Under a broad rubric of growing old, they list out or catalog different things. But what you need to notice here is a kind of a significant difference in the tone, diction, pace, precision. In fact, precision is there in both these pieces of text. but that precision, the nature of that precision, it varies, and so is the object of attention. If you have read the prose passage, you will see how neutral it is. There is no raging rage there. There is no intense passion there. It is neutral, objective to a certain extent, measured in its response to the concept of growing old, and its tone is almost a material like tone. Whereas the excerpt from that poetic piece, it also signifies the process of growing old. But notice the element of musicality there. Notice the element of musicality there. So, here is an interesting quote by the French writer Paul Valéry. Anyone with a watch can tell you what time it is, but who can tell you what is time? So, you can call this distinction somewhat reflective of the distinction between prose and poetry, right? The objective of the prose is to give you what time it is, to give you the time, but poetry is more about understanding the nature of time itself. It is more self-reflexive. Going ahead, I have some more distinction between prose and poetry. So, generally speaking, right at the outset, you can distinguish prose from poetry, because prose is written in complete sentences and paragraphs, whereas poetry has different ways of occupying the space, line fragments, sentence fragments, cryptic words. And as far as prose is concerned, it makes use of normal language pattern, more or less it mimics the everyday conversation, whereas in poetry the use of language is more artistic in nature. Here the purpose is more to express your emotions than to present information. In prose, generally, unless of course there is a word limit, generally speaking you can be very verbose there, whereas poetry does not give you that opportunity. Economy of expression, in fact in poetry economy of expression is very, very important, and generally speaking a prose piece, there are exceptions to all these things, but this is for our general understanding. Okay, prose is easy to understand, and poetry requires a couple of readings. That is why in the context of poetry we said that you will have to read in between the lines. Okay. Here is a Venn diagram that brings out the difference between prose and poetry. We have already discussed the differences between prose and poetry, but what I am interested to show you here through this diagram is the space of intersection. So, a good prose also can have musicality to it, an element that elevates that work to the status of a musical piece. A good prose also makes use of different literary devices. It makes use of language in a very creative way. Both can tell stories. In fact, it is a misnomer to say that you make use of prose to tell stories and you make use of poetry for not saying stories. No, that is not true. In fact, if you look at the origins of poetry, they were basically meant to narrate stories. So, it is a misnomer if somebody says that you can't narrate a story through a poem. It's not a precise understanding. Okay, and both of them can have an element of showing, not describing. Not saying about it, but to make you experience what they are saying. That experiential component, both have that capacity. I was discussing the concept of intersections here. So, we also have something called prose poetry. I was discussing exceptions to these generalizations. Intersections of prose and poetry. You have a prose poem, it is called prose poetry, or a lyrical essay, even an entire novel is written in poetry. So, there are a lot of exceptions to this. Therefore, what I would like to propose, it has already been proposed, but what I would like to bring to your attention is this, that rather than looking at prose and poetry as binaries, rather than looking at prose and verse as binaries, it is better we look at them as as a part of a spectrum called language, different manifestations of language. So, if you look at it as a part of the spectrum called language, then it becomes easy for us to understand exceptions and intersections between prose and poetry. Nevertheless, there are some writers who have taken strong liking to prose, strong liking towards poetry. So, let us discuss some of them. We have Virginia Woolf, a very influential 20th century modernist writer. She says, it is true, poetry is delicious, the best prose is what which is most full of poetry. So, she here you will find her leaning more towards poetry than prose. So, here is another beautiful comparison. Poetry is to prose what dancing is to walking. Both relate to movement, like walking and dancing, they are related to movement, but one is more an aesthetic movement, an elegant movement, the other is more day to day movement. So, the difference between poetry and prose is something like that. Almost extending the analogy, we have another one which says prose talks and poetry sings. Here they are compared to talking and singing. Prose is like talking, poetry is like singing. I just want you to reflect on all these things and see if you agree with them or disagree with them. If you wish to have your own opinions, I am just taking you through some of these diverse opinions concerning prose and poetry here. And we have Samuel Taylor Coleridge, well known poet, considered a romantic poet. This romantic has got to do with the age, romanticism, the movement, the literary movement. So, he says prose is words in their best order, poetry is best words in best order. Think about this clever statement by Samuel Taylor Coleridge. Poetry is so close to music, not just in cadence and sound, but in silences. That is why, to me, I can't talk about prose poems, I can talk about poetic prose. Again, a leaning towards poetry more. Prose is not something to follows. Here is again an opinion. I just came across, while I was looking at some of these quotes, I came across a kind of a witty commonplace quotation. It said, in marriage, if the first chapter of marriage is poetry, the remaining chapters are prose. If the first chapter of marriage is poetry, the remaining chapters are prose. What do you mean by this? Think about it. We will continue this discussion in the next class. Thank you.